Today, we're tearing right through the typical great conqueror narrative you probably heard in history class. We're going to examine the stark, absolute, and frankly brutal reality of Genghis Khan's legacy.
So, let's get right into it. How exactly does one guy, born into exile and just struggling to survive out on the harsh Mongolian steppe, manage to wipe entire civilizations right off the map? In this explainer, we're going to trace a terrifying escalation. We'll follow his atrocities starting from intimate, personal vendettas all the way up to the calculated erasure of entire cultures.
We're breaking down 8 specific, horrific acts today. And as we move through this, I really want you to pay attention to the scale. To understand his mindset, you have to watch how his brutality scaled up over his lifetime, moving from single acts of revenge to full-blown systematic annihilation.
Section 1. Personal vendettas and revenge. From a stolen fish to molten silver. Okay, picture this. Genghis, who was known as Temujin back then, is just 14 years old. His family is living in extreme poverty, basically just foraging to survive. The crime? His half-brother Bektor ate an entire fish they caught and refused to share it. The punishment? Instead of, talking it out or even fighting him hand-to-hand, young Genghis just shoots Bektor in the back with an arrow. It's a darkly absolute form of conflict resolution, but it was absolutely calculated. By eliminating Bektor, who happened to be his mother's favorite, Genghis permanently cemented himself as the undisputed alpha of his family.
Now, fast forward to 1218, and we see how he handles disrespect on a geopolitical level. Genghis sends this massive 450-man peaceful trade caravan over to the city of Otrar in the Khwarezmian Empire. But the governor there, Inalchuk, suspects they're spies and executes the entire caravan. Genghis actually tries diplomacy one more time to resolve the issue, and that diplomat is also killed. This was a catastrophic mistake by the Khwarezmians. You simply do not disrespect Genghis Khan's diplomats.
Because of that one slight, Genghis Khan marched his armies out of Mongolia and absolutely decimated the entire Khwarezmian Empire. The result? An estimated 10 million people died. 10 million. Just let the terrifying scale of that retribution sink in for a second. That whole bloodbath started because a single governor got greedy and disrespected a trade mission. But what happened to Governor Inalchuk, the guy who started the whole shebang, while Genghis captured him alive and delivered a very specific, incredibly gruesome punishment? For his crime of greed, Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured directly onto his eyes and face. It perfectly illustrates his terrifying flair for poetic, deeply personal justice.
Section 2. Cruel and calculated warfare. Siege tactics against the Jin dynasty.
The Mongols actually struggled with large walled Chinese cities at first, so Genghis employed a deeply disturbing tactic called kharash, which basically translates to living boards. He used captured civilians as human shields right at the front lines. And he didn't just use captured soldiers either. He intentionally included women and children. Imagine the absolute psychological horror for the defending soldiers on the walls. They were forced to fire arrows and drop boiling oil on innocent women and children just to even try and hit the Mongol army.
And his warfare was as deceptive as it was cruel. Take the siege of Zhongdu, which is modern-day Beijing. The Jin emperor offered tribute, fully expecting Genghis to accept it and just leave peacefully. But reality hit hard. When the emperor fled to another city, Genghis returned with a vengeance. The Mongols surrounded Zhongdu, cut off all the food, trampled their crops, and intercepted any rescue missions. They even ate the intercepted food right in front of the starving citizens. It got so unimaginably bad inside the city walls that the trapped citizens literally resorted to cannibalism before the Mongols finally broke through.
The terror the Mongols inspired was so absolute that when Zhongdu finally fell, reports say 60,000 women chose to end their own lives. 60,000! They chose death on their own terms rather than falling into the hands of Genghis Khan's invading army.
Section 3. The annihilation of cities. The systematic slaughter of Merv and Nishapur.
700,000. That's the number of citizens in Merv, which was one of the absolute most prosperous cities in the Khwarezmian Empire. Knowing the Mongols' terrifying reputation, the city surrendered, hoping for some mercy. But instead, Genghis' son, Tului, marched an estimated 700,000 surrendered men, women, and children out into the plains and systematically slaughtered almost every single one of them. But the slaughter wasn't enough. They spared just a handful of useful artisans, and then they burned Merv totally to the ground.
But the absolute most calculated detail? They completely destroyed the city's intricate water systems. This wasn't just about winning a battle anymore. It was a deliberate, strategic decision to leave the land permanently barren. He made sure the city could never, ever recover.
And if you thought that was an isolated incident, let's look at Nishapur. During an initial siege there, Genghis Khan's son-in-law was killed by a stray arrow. So, what does Genghis do? He sends that same son, Tului, the architect of the Merv massacre, to extract absolute total revenge. This brilliantly illustrates how Genghis Khan's personal vengeance continually fueled massive, systematic military slaughter. It was an inherited brutality passed straight down to his commanders.
At Nishapur, Tului executed his father's orders to the absolute letter. Every living thing was killed. And the sources mean literally everything: men, women, children, livestock, even the stray dogs and cats in the streets. The city was completely razed. And then, in this macabre display of dominance, they decapitated the victims and erected two massive pyramids of skulls. One pile for the men, and one specifically for the women and children. It's a purely horrifying visual that cemented Mongol terror forever.
Section 4. Total erasure from history. Controlling the narrative in death.
Now, what's really interesting here is how he applied this concept of total erasure to his own death. Genghis wanted to be remembered as a god, which meant his grave could never ever be found. It became this darkly absurd, nesting doll structure of executions. Servants took his body into the wilderness, killing any random witnesses they happened to pass. Once he was buried, the soldiers who buried him were immediately executed by another group of guards. And then, according to legend, those executioners either killed themselves or were killed by a third group. Anyone involved in his burial was systematically murdered just to protect a secret.
But his most sweeping act of erasure wasn't about himself. It was aimed at the Tanguts, also known as the Western Shah civilization. In 1226, near the very end of his life, Genghis offered the Tangut king one last chance to submit. The king said no. So Genghis initiated a rapid, systematic campaign to literally wipe them off the map. Even as he lay gravely ill on his deathbed in 1227, the campaign didn't pause for a second.
My thirst for blood was misguided and I regret everything. Actually, scratch that. Let me stop right there. That quote is a total fake-out. Genghis Khan had absolutely zero regrets on his deathbed. There was no sudden change of heart. He wasn't looking for redemption in his final hours.
In reality, his dying wish was the exact opposite. He gave the final, undeniable order to completely eradicate the Tanguts, and the Mongols carried it out flawlessly. When a new Tangut king tried to surrender, they just murdered him. They burned all of their historical records. They demolished their unique architecture. They forcibly relocated the few survivors across the empire, forcing them to assimilate. And because of these orders, the Tangut language and script completely vanished. He orchestrated a total cultural, physical, and historical death.
The sheer thoroughness of this destruction leads to an incredibly sobering historical assessment. Historian John Mann points out that Genghis Khan's eradication of the Tangut people may very well be the first recorded example in human history of an attempted genocide. It is the extreme, terrifying endpoint of a lifetime of escalating brutality. And to think, it all started over a stolen fish.
When we study history's great conquerors, at what point does military strategy cross the line into pure, inexcusable horror? We often marvel at these massive empires drawn on historical maps, but it is absolutely crucial to understand the very real, brutal human cost required to draw those lines. Thank you so much for joining me to explore the stark reality behind the legacy. Keep questioning the history you've been taught.